A special thank you to the Archie Bray Foundation for sponsoring this episode of Tales of the Red Clay Rambler. The Bray Clay business is your best source for Braypoxy, a two-part moldable epoxy intended for post-firing repairs. Working like clay, it's easy to shape, texture, fill gaps, and recreate missing parts. Braypoxy is sold in tan, white, and black base colors, and we also have a 9-color kit that will allow you to perfectly disguise your repair. To place your order, call us at 406-442-2521 or order online anytime at archiebrayclay.com.
Welcome to the Tales of a Red Clay Rambler podcast, featuring interviews with culture makers from around the world. This is Ben Carter. I'm going to be your host. If you'd like more information on the show, please visit our website, talesofaredclayrambler.com. Welcome back to episode 503 of the podcast. Thank you all for tuning in. Today on the show, I talk with artist and educator Lauren Sandler. In her current body of work, she drapes stacked vessels with beads, beans, and other objects to tell broader economic and cultural narratives. In our interview, we talk about her anthropological approach to materials, adornment through accumulation, and mentoring students at the Tyler School of Art in Philadelphia, where she is an assistant professor. If you'd like to see examples of her work, you can check her out on Instagram or go to laurensandlerstudio.com. I'm excited to have a live taping of this show at this year's NCECA conference in Richmond, Virginia. That is just a few weeks away, and on Thursday, March the 21st at 2:30, Lisa Giuliani and Brian Kakas will join me to talk about the changing landscape of ceramic education. Directly following that, at 4 p.m., guest Red Clay Rambler host Malene Barnett will be recording a panel discussion called Clay Roots: Exploring Ceramics Across the Black Diaspora. We'd love to have you in the audience for both of those, as well as the other 6 live tapings that will be happening during the conference in this year's podcast room. If you'd like to find out more about the conference and to register, you can go to NCECA.net. Also wanted to take a quick minute and thank the folks that have recently donated to our podcast. I'd like to thank Eddie Jackson, Sarah Chenoweth-Davis, and Courtney Stogsdill for their recent contributions. We are listener-supported, so I'd love for you to get involved in joining the Red Clay Rambler community over on Patreon. You can make a one-time or an ongoing donation at patreon.com/redclayrambler. Without further ado, we'll get to the interview. A lot of your work recently uses accumulation as the visual language. So there's things that are both stacked on top of each other, or there are things at which they come together. So there was this piece years ago where you had almost like an amphora or a shape that had stacks of bones, stacks of other types of things accumulated in this vessel. So can you just talk about accumulation? What's interesting visually about that for you?
Maybe I'll start by talking about how I kind of came to building that way, which was first the stacking, and then that was followed by this kind of the accumulation and that using that as a way of adorning the objects. But that's how I've been working for a number of years now, and that really began several years ago when I came upon this particular object, a Lacanus pot from Centeripe, Sicily, and that came really about by conversations that I was having with students at the time, where we were talking about appropriation in ceramics. And that's something I think that, well, it's something that happens a lot. Often we teach ceramics by having students copy, which I guess I understand perhaps some of the skill development there, but I always took issue with doing that without kind of larger contextual conversations. And so we were having this discussion and about the things that we look at and we're influenced by, and how, depending on what that is and who I am, there's certain power dynamics that are established there, and how do we address that? So really those conversations led me to start to do some research on objects that I have kind of cultural connections to based upon my familial background. And one of those, and so I came across this Centuripe object through that. My mother's father's family is from that region in Sicily. And I was really fascinated by that object for multiple reasons. One was just having that kind of personal connection to it. They were interesting objects. There's not that much written about them. There's not many that exist really in collections. They were made for a brief period of time between like 300 and 200 BCE. But they were also very visually strange to me. They were visually awkward, which I loved. And part of that, I think, visual awkwardness was, I believe that some of them were just stacked, even though they were pots. They had a foot, they had a shallow kind of body bowl with a conical lid and this kind of tall finial. But many of the parts were stacked, and that gave a kind of visual awkwardness. And I loved that about them. And I thought, well, that's really interesting. And so that's how I started constructing these vessels using that process of just stacking. And in part, it just gave a lot of freedom. It was fun. It allowed for me to change things up very quickly. I didn't have to be, it let go of certain kind of, I don't know, technical restrictions. It also, conceptually, I was more interested in making vessels and not necessarily an object of utility. And so it allowed me to move into thinking broadly about the vessel rather than this holds this material. And so I started stacking objects then. And then also part of those original objects that I was looking at, the Centuripe pots, they were adorned and embellished. In part, they were polychromatic. They often had kind of a facade, in the way that architecture at the time had facades, and they with clay added to them. And so I was also really drawn to that kind of over-the-top embellishment, and I was drawn to that. And so I started also at the time covering, hanging, adorning, using this process of accumulation with different objects as a way to kind of explore different narratives and different stories within and on each object. And so using, literally like covering the form, at the point, I mean, I'm a big pincher, and I always pinch my objects. But at one point, I remember thinking, I don't even want to see the surface of this piece. I want it to completely be covered. And I was interested in that use of accumulation in part, it was kind of how to kind of create this over-the-top object, but I was also thinking about abundance. I was thinking about adornment, and in this idea of abundance as something that also implies ideas of value and wealth and plenty, and ideas of economies, which is something I think a lot about. So it was also allowing me to kind of bring in other signifiers and other ways of exploring some of the narratives and content that I was interested in bringing in. And also, I think, well, I know for me, that process, it's also a visual tactic. It's a way to kind of visually allure, hopefully, someone to kind of maybe look a little closer and ask some questions about the object and what is going on here. Why is this covered with this object or this other material, or it's both some other materials as well with some of the newer work. And for me, that is a way to also, I think a lot about material culture, material objects, and the larger contextual histories around different material goods. And this idea of accumulation for me is also a way to kind of challenge the kind of presumptive neutrality of material and of objects. And so kind of going back to that, what I was saying earlier, I'm less interested in utility and more interested in vessels. I'm less interested in making a teapot, and I'm more interested in making a vessel that talks about tea. There's two different ways of approaching making an object. And so some of these tactics of accumulation, of adornment, are ways for me to think about the different histories of different materials and different goods, to think more about the production or the consumption or the movement of those objects, the people, the labor, the lives, that are within the, that bring those objects to us or those goods to us, and all of that kind of context around them. So it's been, it's kind of like a tool for me to kind of go a little bit deeper into all of that and challenge the ideas of what a vessel can be.
One of the things you said is questioning the neutrality, or highlighting that objects are not neutral, that they are imparted with the material culture from wherever they are or wherever they have been. So a lot of times, by the time we see the object in the U.S., it's already accumulated a couple layers of information. And I'm thinking specifically trade goods, because I know that's an area you've looked at as well. Something like food, like if you import olive oil from Italy, just because I'm thinking about Sicily, there's the Italian graphic design label, and then there's an English graphic design label put on top of that. And it's just language. It's just two different forms of language. But instantly you have two different aesthetic cultures that are often smashed together. And that's just a cooking implement. So can you talk about how you started thinking about this? Because material culture, I know you have a degree in anthropology as well, which I think probably plays into this, but material culture is something as a word that comes in and out of ceramic dialogue. Sometimes it's there, sometimes it's not. So how did you start thinking about this, about material culture as a whole?
I mean, it definitely is rooted in my undergraduate studies. My first undergraduate degree is in anthropology, which is really how I came to even be thinking about clay and ceramics. It was through clay as artifact, as remnant. That was, I wasn't thinking about ceramics as an art form, or even working with the material as an artist. And it was clay as material culture. And that is how I think of it. I'm not coming to it as, well, I am coming to it as an artist, but I'm really thinking about the expansiveness of this material, which is why I love working with the material as an artist. There's so much there to engage in, and ways of using this material to talk about so many different things. And I think about that all the time, and about how, this is something I'll often say is, this material that obviously it's all around us. We know essentially every culture in the world has a relationship to this material in one way or another. And it's the cup that I drink out of every day. It's in the cap in my tooth. It's in the building. I live in a house made of bricks. It's in multiple industries that are all around us: architecture, health, medicine, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that ubiquity also allows for us as artists to use it to talk about a lot of different things, personal, social, cultural, political, economics, et cetera. So that has just always been what it's been to me, because I think I came to it as like, we're looking at, a piece of an object, and what can we learn from this? Where's this from? Who used this? What was it used for? What does it tell us about the culture and the time and the people that it came from? That was how I initially started looking at ceramics. And that's what was always intriguing to me about it. So it's always just, that's kind of, to me, what it's about, And so, I think that's always been how I'm using it. It's a way for me to think about, it's archival, that's what clay is. It's an archival material. And so for me, it's such an amazing material, therefore, to tell stories with because of that. What those stories can vary, as they do for all of us. But I'm so interested in the complexities of it, in the layers of it. And often for me, I think I'm also interested in using that history or that embedded meaning, or that idea of it being archival, as a way to also unearth stories, or complicate stories, or tell stories that perhaps have been erased or forgotten or obfuscated. So that's, a lot of the vessels that I'm making are often looking at past objects like that centeripe pot, but really as a way to also think about the context in which that object originated. And like, for example, when I was doing research on those centeripe pots, I was also looking at a lot of objects of ancient Roman and Greek objects, other things of that era and time period. And that got me thinking a lot about objects of antiquity, and thinking about like those kind of white marble figurative statues that we've all grown up seeing in museums, and how those were presented to us as monochromatic. But we know now they were like those centeripe pots, they were polychromatic, and they were embellished with color and gilding and inlay and all of that. But when, many of us were brought up thinking that they were white, and that, I'm interested in like, well, how did that happen? How did that story come to us? Well, that's because the times in which they were kind of, quote, rediscovered in the Renaissance, they were presented as white, really as a way to equate whiteness with beauty, and and that has been obviously challenged and changed in more recent decades. And so, and even this idea of what it means to be, what it meant to be then of part of the Roman Empire. You can be Roman and be Roman or Judean or Syrian or Nubian, or, it's about kind of looking at the complexities of these narratives and how they came to be, who was perpetuating these for what purposes. And so that to me is that, is getting to those ideas of these kind of, what cultural material, and what does that mean? And how does that meaning shift, through time and space?
I want to break it down for the listener. Let's talk about the stack forms, because they're amazing. So you have shapes that are stacked together to make the vessel, but often then on the surface of the vessel itself, there will be sculptural, as you mentioned, almost like a facade, like a layer of that. But then back from that, you'll often have beads, shells, or things that reference smaller objects that are hung on that. So there's a couple different layers of information within just those stack forms. So once you get to that outer layer, because I think that's maybe what people see first, because it's the most active, there's often strings of beads that kind of diagonally move across what is otherwise a very solid, vertically stacked form. How do you think about that? Like, how do you think about the small element being an activation of the bigger thing?
I'll plan these out a lot of the time now. I'll start by thinking about either a particular material or goods or object that I kind of want to research more and investigate further. And then I'll really I'll draw it out, and I'll do a lot of research and looking and reading and thinking. And I'll, for example, like my piece, economies of beans. So that piece, it has it stacked. I'll start with like the main form that I'll usually throw. It's a combination. I throw it and I hand build it to get the shape and the scale that I want. And a lot of these pieces, I'm making some larger pieces now, but the pieces that we're talking about, the ones that are all ceramic, are like 2 to 3 feet tall. So I'll make the parts, the main body, and then kind of midsections. I call them midsections, which are really level. It's a way to kind of level and a way for me to kind of stack a part on top of a stack. They're like slab parts that are in between sections that I can then I use those for spaces to hang elements from, but then also to stack on top of. And then so like this economies of beans, that piece is covered in handmade coffee beans, and it's all ceramic. So there's a lot of repetition in what I do, which I really love. I like, making a decision and then spending a week just doing it. It's like, I know what I'm doing every day. I just come in here and I'm like, this is what I'm doing. I'm just making coffee beans all day. There's something to me just really satisfying about that way of repetitive work. And that gives a certain tactility to the surface. And then to your point, there's the element of hanging and suspending. And to me, that's the adorning, and it's a way of kind of, I think of it as in some ways like jewelry, in the way like we adorn our bodies, and it is and I do use gold luster in parts of the objects as well to kind of give that little bit of the bling that brings to it, and that too brings in ideas of value and of certainly the values of gold, as well as other ideas that I can talk about later about extraction and so on, mineral extraction and other ideas of extraction. But then the hanging parts are also ways for me to kind of play with the composition, and also ways to complicate it in a way. And so with that economies of beans piece, it's covered with coffee beans, and then it's hung with soybeans, cacao beans, and cacao pods. Those are the elements that I'm working with. And for this piece, I was thinking about types of agricultural production, and kind of the violence of agricultural production. And so with the soybeans, I think I hung them in a way that almost looks like bullets over a chest in a way, And then like, to me, the cacao pods almost are like grenades as well. So it's also for me a way I realize like in making objects that kind of are visually alluring, they're also just can be pretty, which is fine, but I'm also not just interested in making pretty objects. And so this is also a way for me to complicate that a little bit in the ways that I can play with composition with those hanging elements that you were talking about.
You have a show up right now at the Philadelphia airport where you're showing multiple of these pieces, and they're even larger. You've made, I don't want to say extensions, but there's large parts that raise the core part of the vessel up so that it's in the ballpark of a human body. And as you talked about hanging things like bullets and grenades, I was like, right, you're anthropomorphizing the object by making that vessel have some qualities that are human. And in the description that's on the Philadelphia website, I had read something where you were interested in the allure of adornment. But what I thought it said was the failure of adornment. I just misread what it said. And so I was looking, I'm like, the failure of adornment, what does that mean? And then I started thinking about these vessels as being so overly adorned that if it was a person, you couldn't move. That all of a sudden the adornment makes you, it's like an armor. Like it protects you, but also you can't move anymore. So it made me to start thinking about like, at what point visually does adornment become too much to process? And then all of a sudden it just reads as energy. So it doesn't read as symbol. It reads as holy shit.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Totally.
Yeah. So
I like
can you
that.
talk about that? Like the top end of this where the accumulation is so much that it's almost hard to grasp.
Yeah, I get that. And I also like that idea of a failure of failure of adornment is what you thought it was? That's good too. It's actually, it'd be interesting. I like that. Yeah, it is over the top. And I think I'm still kind of at the point of figuring out like what's too much and what's enough, and I think I've been wanting it to be too much. I'm still in the phase of wanting it to be too much. And I have to think about more of why. Part of that is just a kind of certain satisfaction of just, I just want it to be too much. um, and, um, and especially with those tall pieces that you're talking about, yes, they are like a little bit, they're like 5.5 feet tall. They're like kind of my height, and adding in following the same format of construction of those smaller pieces that we were just talking about. Like there's the main part, and there's midsections, and there's a finial, and there's a foot. It's all the same components, but I've just kind of blown it up in a way, and then added some elements that are also even breaking up the idea of the vessel further. And part of that was kind of addressing the idea. I was like, oh, they're just beautiful objects, which I was feeling like they were at like 2 and 3 feet tall. Like, oh, these are just very pretty things. Look at that. And trying and wanting to, how do I kind of, I don't know, how do I bring some of these other ideas, maybe even, the viewer doesn't have to know the whole narrative that I'm trying to tell or what my research was, but I certainly want them to get a sense of complexity. And maybe that's some of that, like it's too much. It's complicating it. But also part of me trying to do that was further disrupting the idea of what a vessel is. And I still refer to even those 5-foot pieces as vessels. To me, they're still vessels. And the way that a vessel is a body, as you talked about, it is, it's a body, it's a building, it's a monument. It's kind of, and I think as I get larger, it becomes all of those things. And I've always thought of my work as also being this intersection of those things, of body, of building, of culture. I've always been interested in how these things kind of, and how ceramic objects can be an intersection of that. And so those pieces I'm perhaps hopefully are starting to do that in another way. And yeah, that over too much, I don't know. There's something to me that I just get such a satisfaction of it, and part of that is also the pleasure of it. And I think that's also really important as artists, in allowing our work to also be pleasurable for us. I think that's something I remind myself of more, perhaps when I'm talking to my students, when, that grappling, we're always grappling with things, whether it's like just a technique or a form or an idea. And it can become sometimes, like I watch it with students, it becomes painful. And it's like, I get that. And I experience that myself, but it's like, it also has to be pleasurable. And I think for me, that abundance is also just, it allows me to just have fun as well with the pieces.
And I think visually it serves the content when you're talking about economy. Mm-hmm. Because trade goods are moving so fast through the economy that we don't think about them as individuals anymore. It's almost like we think of them as mass. So coffee, for instance, is just a commodity. Like internationally, the cost of coffee goes up and down. And we don't think about that because it's coffee. But if you say that the cost of gold goes up and down, everyone's like, oh, right, yeah, it's an economy of gold. So I think there's something about your anthropological training and also just your interest as a human that you're trying to get people to look beyond sort of the aesthetic of the object to have the conversation. How do you do that? Like, how do you get people to engage with the bigger cultural idea when what they might be saying is, oh, look at that color gray? You know what I mean? Or does something aesthetic about the object?
Absolutely. And I think that is something I've been struggling with, and goes back to like, how do they not just stay as like, oh, that's a compelling object, and then that's the end of it. Part of that, titles, I think I like titling work. I think about the titles of the work and like that use of the word economies. I use that word in a number of the objects, and that kind of like, okay, I'm looking at this, but maybe why is this called economies of beans or economies of salt or whatever it might be? And I think that is, a certain thread, for the viewer to be like, why is that? And then look closer and maybe see more layers of the object. I think of, in some of those kind of formal decisions, like I was talking about the beans piece, trying to like that, bringing in maybe that consideration of one's body, as a way to, it moves beyond an object and it sort of starts to hold perhaps different meaning or layers of meaning. I think with the pieces, when I started working in this stacked way, the way that the objects can be assembled and disassembled, and is something that has always interested me. And it's funny, a number of years ago when I started building this way, I would sometimes just record myself assembling and disassembling. And I have like some of those are on my website. And I realized when I started doing that and watching them, suddenly I thought, oh, well, maybe that's the piece. The piece is the disassembling of it, perhaps, rather than the object. And I still haven't figured out how I present that, honestly. How does it become the act of disassembly rather than here's a static object? But so I think that too, how do I bring that in, the idea of like, this is something that can be assembled and disassembled, is part of the meaning as well, and in the ways in which meaning can be disassembled and assembled, or constructed and deconstructed. And what are the ways in which meaning is constructed and deconstructed? Who tells the story, who doesn't tell the story? How do the framing of stories affect the context? And the histories or stories that we may be perpetuating, and that mutability of meaning. And so, I mean, that's something that I'm still kind of working out. And I think that idea of assembly and disassembly, for me to find ways to bring that more forward, is also a way to kind of challenge or perhaps bring up some of these other ideas that I'm also playing with and thinking about. So that is an ongoing challenge and question that I have is, how do I bring in those complications or the consideration of those complexities and layers and context into the experience of the object?
We'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsors. Today's episode is brought to you by the Rosenfield Collection of Functional Ceramic Art. The collection exists as an online resource for research and inspiration, featuring photos of over 4,000 objects made by over 1,000 artists. The images are high quality and can be used with no permission required, making them a great resource for students and teachers. To find out more, visit rosenfieldcollection.com. I want to talk about how place affects this, because one of the ways that we see visually this idea of layers of meaning in a composite is city life. So let's look at Philadelphia. Like, specific neighborhoods have music styles, depending on where you're at, food styles. Any big city kind of has this. There's small towns within the bigger thing. But then Philadelphia has its own identity as the bigger umbrella, which is interesting to me. Like, Philly is still a city I live about an hour north of you. And so I come to Philadelphia somewhat regularly, and I'm still trying to figure it out. Because when I grew up in the South, Philadelphia was the place of the first constitutional convention. There's this like revolutionary history that's always kind of floating around. Yeah. But if you're on the streets of Philadelphia, that's not what it's about. Like, it is a vibrant arts, music, sports city that there's so much going on. So can you talk about how you've come to understand Philadelphia as someone that's moved into that area somewhat recently?
Yeah, I love that. A lot of the things you said there. Well, one, I'm still trying to figure it out, very much so. And as a New Yorker, I grew up in New York City, which is only 2 hours from here. I don't think I visited Philadelphia until I was an adult. so it was like, I don't even know if I even thought about Philadelphia as a New Yorker. We're so like, New York is the center of the world, and I was certainly raised by parents who thought that as native New Yorkers. So I'm still very much trying to figure out Philadelphia. And this is like kind of an ongoing conversation my partner and I have, both of us being from New York. And also, I like the things you were saying, because I think growing up in a city has also always been very central in my thinking, and also in my thinking about ceramics and this idea going back to like cultural material, cultural objects. I've always thought about like the cities as these kind of changing, developing places. But so I think about those things a lot. And yes, coming to Philadelphia, I've been here for less than 5 years, has been interesting in trying to kind of make sense of it. And my way of doing that has really been through actually looking at the history of it. And my way of looking at the history of it is experiencing it through the history of clay and the kind of the settler colonial industries that this city is built upon and are still not relevant, but prevalent, I'd say, certainly architecturally. And in other ways, absolutely. So, when I moved here, I was already into kind of exploring a place through clay, through just like digging local clays. And I really started to do that further here. And you drive around the city and there's also enormous amount of development and construction going on. And I started just driving around with a bucket in my car. And whenever I'd see like a new hole in the ground because they're building a building, I would go and I would collect some of that dirt and I would bring it back to my studio and I'd start to work with it. And then I'm really interested in bricks in particular. And I had that interest. And then I moved to Philly and it's like this city is built on bricks, literally and figuratively. And so I started making bricks and thinking about that as, talk about bricks as material objects and the layers of meaning and economies and labor and lives in that, both as a historic object and also as a contemporary object. And so using the history of clay here to think about the history of this place, whether it's from the Lenape people to the settler colonial people to clay as a central industry here, as after Ohio in the 1800s and 1900s, it was like the place of the most made clay objects in the country. It's such a particular history, but that history has shaped what this city is now. That's how I've been kind of trying to make sense of this place. And so I've also then been taking that interest and working with different local community gardens, which is also something that is pervasive in this city, which I love, like, the role of community gardens and gardening in this city has been so fascinating to me. And working with people in neighborhoods and in different neighborhoods to work with the clay that is local to them, making objects with them that rather than we take them and extract them and go do something separate in a way, working with them to make objects that are from that place and stay in that place. And that's been a way to really talk about this whole like history of place, and bringing it back to the place now and what's happening in that place now and the changes that are happening in these neighborhoods now through material and object making collectively.
Looking at bricks is like a building unit, but also a cultural unit is so interesting to me. I'm doing research on the Archie Bray because we're doing a podcast about the history of that. So I've been studying bricks. And one of the least shipped objects are bricks because they're so heavy. Like, unless you can put them on a railway, you cannot ship bricks by truck. Like, it is just too hard. And so when you go backwards in time, lots of towns had brick factories. Like, having a brick factory was not unusual. I grew up in a town with a brick factory, so I was kind of used to that. But I think we almost take bricks for granted now. Like we don't see them. They become invisible. So I love the workshops you've been doing where you go around and people build a brick. So they get to see like, what does it take to cram clay in a brick mold? Because it is a physical process. It is not a dainty thing to get clay into a brick mold. You have to smash it in there. So what do you think people are learning in these educational environments by making something as mundane, but also as amazing as a brick?
Yeah, I love that. And it's such a simple process, and that's still how, people are still making bricks the same way that they made bricks thousands of years ago, which you have a simple wooden mold and you have a clump of wet clay and you just slam it in and then you cut it off and you release the mold. There's your brick. It's done. And that's how I'm making them with people. And I think people are maybe sometimes surprised at how simple it is. It can be more complicated. And obviously people also use machinery now to do that, but it's essentially the same process. And I think that it's especially doing it in a place like Philadelphia, where many of the people that I'm doing it with we live in brick homes, or we're just surrounded by it. And I don't know, it allows for a different connection to one's surrounding, I think, through the object. And also particularly then when we're doing it with clay that we've just dug from that location, it creates that sense of connection to place, hopefully, I think, in a different way. And yeah, it's been fun doing it. It's been just really fun. And when I do these workshops, it's also really interesting to see what people start to do without me giving them prompts. The last workshop I did in the fall before it got really cold was just this in a community garden. We made 75 bricks and I just showed them how to do it. And then they started doing it. And then every single one of those bricks has some marking on it that they themselves just started it's clay, it's wet. And they just on their own started pressing their hands into it, picking up things that were around and drawing and mark making and making their own marks on them. So that also the object they personalize it, it becomes a different kind of archive, and I loved that. I didn't even have to talk about that. They just inherently started using this as that kind of their own canvas, to make their own mark on it. So it's been a fun way of working with people, both in understanding, I don't know, in just kind of collective making, but also connecting us to this ubiquitous, as you said, this mundane object that is all around us. And I think it kind of has the potential of maybe just changing our perspective of, I don't know, our surroundings in some really basic way.
Yeah, I think it also engages with people that we live in a built environment. Every brick was made and then laid. That is so different than, say, something like concrete, where it just reads as this unified surface going up. But actually, I wanted to switch and talk about Tyler and talk about teaching. The first time I ever heard you speak was in NCECA in 2019. You were on a panel on radical mentorship. And someone asked a question, which I wrote down all these years ago, which I'm going to ask you now, which is, how do you mentor in a way that doesn't impose your values on the person? So can you talk a little bit about that in terms of mentorship and teaching?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't remember it. Yeah, that's hard. I mean, we're human. And in some ways that's impossible. I don't know if I strive to do that. I'm more striving of how to just keep that awareness very front and center, and to know when that's happening and the different ways in which that is happening, that can both be positive and maybe not so positive. But yes, I've been teaching for many years. I've always been interested in teaching, from the beginnings of working with clay. I remember as an undergraduate student, when I returned back to school and worked with clay and assisting, I think when I went back to school and I did my second undergraduate at SUNY New Paltz, in ceramics. And early on in that experience, I went to Haystack for like a short weekend to assist Ayumi Horie, who was teaching at New Paltz at the time, with a workshop with her. And I remember very early at that point being like, oh, I love this. I love teaching this. I love talking to people about this. And I knew then, like, I also want to be teaching this, not just working with the material as an artist. And I think for me, teaching is both, it's a way to challenge things. It challenges myself, certainly, but it's also for me a way to challenge kind of larger systems and structures that can be harmful or oppressive in ways, and to bring larger conversations and dialogue around the systems and structures that I myself am a part of, by the fact that I'm an educator in an institution of higher ed. And so that, I bring that thinking to my teaching. And for me also, being a mentor is about, how do I utilize the resources that I have access to and bring those to my students, who may not have the same access to things that I do, by the fact of many, many different things, who I am, where I'm from, my age, my position, and then all the things that provides me. And also it's a space for me, certainly being in a space of higher ed, and all of us who have come through that space within ceramics. I think many of us, depending on one's age, perhaps, were brought through a certain narrative of ceramics. And that, I think, like a certain canon, if you will. And that, I think, is often a very kind of Eurocentral-based canon with this kind of East Asian focus and fascination. And like, I'll talk about that. And I think those histories are meaningful and relevant and full, but they're also, I think, many of us are perhaps brought through those as though they are the default, and they are centralized, when we know that there's, kind of going back to this idea of clay and its ubiquity, there's so much that is left out of that story, and so many people, both historic and contemporary makers, that are kind of obfuscated in that telling. And I'm interested in challenging that and complicating that, and that's how I think about it. It's how I talk to students about it. And so for me, it's a space to kind of engage in those conversations. And it's, I don't know, I find I learned so much from being a teacher. I can't quite even imagine, I don't know, it's an interesting question for me to think about, what kind of artist would I be if I didn't teach? And it's hard for me to even imagine that a little bit, because I think so much of my learning is through teaching.
Yeah, and I found that there's a certain type of percolation that happens in the mind when you're teaching. You're teaching one thing, but you're thinking about something else. Or you can be thinking about some aspect of that, and it just sits up there, and it's kind of going around and around. And then when you get to the studio, then something comes out. Which I think that process, I too found that, like, even workshop teaching, if I'm with someone for 2 weeks, like, I come back feeling so much better. I'm like, man, thank you guys for letting me teach you.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think of that, and maybe this goes back to your questions about what does mentorship mean in some ways. To me, it is an exchange. I realize that there are power dynamics there, in different ways, but at its best, it is an exchange. We all have something to bring. And I'm always, to your point, also, gaining, in a good teaching day, I'm also coming back nourished and filled from that exchange.
I want to dissect the power dynamic a little bit, if we can. There's often this reverence for the teacher. Like, I think that comes from the guild system, where there was the master and then there was the apprentice. And that's a very great way to teach skills. Like, if you want to teach a skill, having respect for the teacher and then following the teacher, great. If you want to teach content and independent thinking, sometimes not so great. Because then if the teacher doesn't happen to like what you're making, you can lose confidence in the idea when in reality it's just aesthetics. The teacher might just not like the aesthetic. So can you talk about how you can empower students in the classroom to disagree with you, so to speak, or disagree with what you like or don't like?
Yeah, and I think that's something that I think certainly for me to keep that awareness front and center. Certainly I have my preferences, aesthetics and but I think I've gotten, I think over the years of just teaching, I can identify that more quickly of what I might be responding to or not responding to. But I think for me, it is keeping the students' questions front and center. Keeping their questions front and center, and also creating an environment that it is less, don't, come to the meeting or the discussion with your own questions, them, meaning the students. What would be helpful for you? What are you grappling with? What are you interested in? What are you struggling with? What are you exploring right now? What are your hopes here? What are your challenges here? Let that be the starting point of the discussion. And so I think if we start there and also creating an environment amongst the group, and certainly between my relationships with the students, of if things get off track, if I've just led you down a path that Lauren, I have no interest in what you're talking about right now, and this is really not helpful for me, that we've created, we've laid down some expectations, or kind of ground rules, if you will, hopefully, that they can say that's interesting. However, can we bring it back over here? Because this is really what I'm grappling with. And that it creates some guardrails where maybe it's like something they're showing me, maybe it's getting me really excited, but it's not helpful for them, And so I think that a lot of that is just in establishing relationships, a lot of talking, a lot of ways to kind of break down that hierarchy, and part of breaking down the hierarchy is recognizing that there is an innate hierarchy,
if you see it, you can live outside of it. But if you can't see it, you're going to be in it.
Yeah. And if you see it, you can name it. And you can say, this is what's happening here. And then therefore we can engage in changing that, which to me is also part of my larger pedagogy, is to challenge those things. I mean, that's in some ways what I'm wanting to do in my work, in my practice, and in my teaching. And so how do we create a space that models that? Imperfectly. I'm not saying I do this and it's like it works all the time, or it's like I'm some pro at this. I think this is something that we're always stumbling our way through these things. But I think if that is part of the foundation and part of the purpose, and it's part of the pedagogy, that, hopefully, becomes part of the studio, becomes part of the program, it becomes part of the culture. And then I can maybe even step back and just watch it grow and happen in the space.
Well, to wrap up, can you talk about the NCECA show? Can you just tell us where the show is so people can come and see it?
It's called Unsettling Extractions, and it's at VisArts, what is it? The Visual Arts something of Richmond. I'm forgetting exactly. It's the same location as the student juried show, the NCECA show. So it'll be in that same space, Unsettling Extractions, and it's me with a show I organize, and there's 6 other artists who's in it: Jasmine Bates, Rahale Filsufi, Victoria Walton, Margaret Boozer, Ruben Alguin, Eugene, AJ. I think that's all of us. I hope I didn't miss a name there. And it's really exploring this larger idea of extraction, which is a thing, an act, and process, an idea that I've been thinking a lot about for many, many years. And I think about it broadly, in part, material extraction, as we are all engaged in ceramics, but larger ideas of extraction, whether it's extraction of ideas or knowledge or culture, aesthetics and so on, and the kind of complicating that in a way. So that's happening at NCECA, at Viz Arts.
Yeah, look forward to seeing that. And then can you leave your social media so people could get in touch? And also, Tyler, the deadlines for the visiting artist and also the other stuff.
Thanks for mentioning that. Yeah, my Instagram is Lauren Sandler Studio. And I'll be posting things there about stuff that I'm involved in upcoming NCECA. And then Tyler Ceramics, I think, is our Instagram. I think it's Tyler Ceramics. And yes, we have wonderful programs there. We have both Artists in Residence, which is something I love about our program. That's April 1st. We'll be posting stuff about that. And we also have a special student program, also April 1st. That'll be up on our social media. And we'll also have a table at the resource table at the convention center. And I'll be there along with other students. And so folks can feel free to come by. I'll be in and out of that space throughout NCECA, and they can talk to me about it there as well.
Well, thanks so much, Lauren. This has been a pleasure. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It was really nice. I appreciate it.
I'd like to thank Lauren for coming on the show. It was a pleasure to chat with her. As you heard, she does have a show at this year's NCECA conference, so make sure to check that out in person. I'm happy to be featuring Lauren in the book, The Complete Guide to Low-Fire Glazes for Potters and Sculptors, which I wrote and am in the editing process for. It's been a joy to feature folks like Lauren, whose work I really admire, so I appreciate her submitting and being a part of that book as well. Before we go, I wanted to thank today's sponsors. That's the Rosenfield Collection of Functional Ceramic Art and the Archie Bray Clay Biz. If you're interested in being a part of this show through sponsoring an episode, you can get in touch at brickyardnetwork.org. I'll be back next week with another episode. Thank you all for tuning in. If you'd like more information on the artists on the show, or if you'd like more information about the workshops and events that I'll be having in the next couple months, you can follow me on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook under Carter Pottery. Another great way to support the show is to leave me a comment on iTunes. To do that, search Tales of a Red Clay Rambler under iTunes Podcasts, and you'll find a page that's linked to our show. Thank you guys for the support.
This podcast is a production of the Brickyard Network, an extension of the Archie Bray Foundation for the Ceramic Arts. To find out more about our lineup of ceramic podcasts, visit brickyardnetwork.org.